Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Susana Ruiz case. In early January 1993, the air in Madrid was biting. We begin on a birthday night in the San Blas district, where 16-year-old Susana joins her friends for a celebration under the city lights, unaware that the evening would mark the start of a decades-long enigma. The winter wind in the capital does not just blow. It whispers through the narrow alleys and over the wide, concrete plazas of the outskirts. It is a dry, sharp cold that settles in the bones and turns every breath into a fleeting cloud of silver mist. In the quiet hours of that Saturday, the 9th of January, the city was a tapestry of deep shadows and the amber glow of sodium street lamps. San Blas in the early 90s was a place of hard-working families and sturdy brick buildings. It was a district with a pulse of its own, separate from the grand boulevards of the city center. Here, the streets were lined with the echoes of daily life, but on this particular night, the normal rhythms had slowed to a winter crawl. Imagine the sound of a distant car engine fading into the distance, leaving only the rustle of dry leaves against a chain-link fence. The district of San Blas Canalejas felt like an island of light, surrounded by the vast, dark stretches of undeveloped land that lay between the city and the neighboring towns of Coslada and Vicalvaro. It was in these transitional spaces, where the pavement gives way to gravel and the streetlights grow sparse, that our story takes root. Susana Ruiz was a girl of 16 years, a daughter of the district, living in a home within the very walls of the Las Muses Institute, where her father served as the caretaker. She was a presence of warmth in the middle of a frozen season, known for her spirit and the typical bright energy of a teenager on the verge of adulthood. On that evening, she had asked for permission to go out to celebrate a friend's birthday. There is something uniquely poignant about the rituals of youth, the choosing of an outfit, the shared secrets, the laughter that rings out just a little too loud in the stillness of the night. Susana was dressed for the occasion, her boots clicking softly on the floor as she prepared to step out into the January air, promising to be home, unaware that the promise would soon become a haunting memory for those who waited. The destination was an old, abandoned house, often referred to as the Caserón, a skeletal structure that sat on the edge of the urban sprawl. In the 90s, such places became makeshift sanctuaries for the youth, where the constraints of the world felt distant. Inside the Caserón, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the biting exterior. There was the low thrum of music, the scent of smoke, and the collective warmth of 20 or 30 young people gathered to celebrate. They were huddled in groups, sharing drinks and stories, their voices bouncing off the graffiti-covered walls. Susana was there, a part of the light and the noise. For a few hours, the cold was forgotten. The abandoned house, despite its peeling paint and broken windows, felt like a kingdom of their own making, a temporary escape from the watchful eyes of the adult world. As the clock moved toward the early morning hours of January 10th, the party began to thin out. The laughter became more sporadic, and the fatigue of a long night started to settle in. It was around 3:30 in the morning when Susana decided it was time to head back. The transition from the crowded, smoky warmth of the house to the absolute silence of the wasteland outside must have been jarring. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of damp earth and iron from the nearby sepiolite mines. She stood for a moment before beginning the walk. Her path home was not long, but it required crossing those dark, liminal spaces where the city's light struggles to reach. The ground was uneven, a mixture of dirt paths and construction debris, silvered by the frost. She walked alone, or so it seemed. The sounds of the party faded behind her, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of her boots on the frozen ground. In the distance, the lights of San Blas twinkled like fallen stars, a beacon of safety that appeared so close, yet felt unreachable in the heavy stillness. Every shadow under a lone tree, Every rustle of a discarded plastic bag in the breeze became a part of the quiet landscape. As she moved further from the Casaron and toward the familiar streets of her neighborhood, the silence deepened. It was a silence that would soon stretch from minutes into hours, and eventually into weeks. Susana Ruiz, a girl of 16, was walking toward home, but she was also walking into a mystery that would remain unsolved for over 30 years. The night held its breath, and then she was gone. The ticking of the clock in the small caretaker's residence was usually a comforting, steady presence. It marked the quiet life of Jesus Ruiz and his family, who lived within the walls of the Vocational Training Institute, where he worked as the guard. But on the morning of January 9th, 1993, that rhythmic sound transformed into a heavy, agonizing count. The deadline had passed. 3:30 in the morning, the time Susana had promised to be home, had come and gone without the sound of her key in the lock or the soft creak of the floorboards. In the silence of the San Blas neighborhood, the air was brittle with a dry, midwinter cold that seemed to seep through the stone walls of the school. Her father sat in the stillness, his eyes fixed on the door, watching the minutes stretch into an hour. The school, normally a place of learning and safety, felt cavernous and hollow. Every shadow in the hallway seemed to stretch toward him, mirroring the growing void where his daughter should have been. By 4 o'clock, the silence had become unbearable. Jesus and his wife, Josepha, began the frantic ritual that every parent fears. They reached for the telephone, the cord stretching as they paced the small kitchen. One by one, they dialed the numbers of Susana's friends. Each ring was a jagged intrusion into the night. On the other end of the lines, sleepy voices of teenagers answered, thick with confusion and the lingering haze of the party. No, they said. They hadn't seen her since she left the birthday celebration at the old, abandoned house in Vicalvaro. She had been in good spirits, laughing and enjoying the music. She was wearing her favorite heavy metal-style clothes, a reflection of her vibrant, 16-year-old spirit. They remembered her stepping out into the freezing night, perhaps a little tired, but determined to make it home before her curfew. The realization that she had vanished somewhere between the fading music of the party and the safety of her bed began to settle over the Ruiz household like a thick, suffocating frost. Unable to wait any longer, Jesus pulled on his heavy coat and stepped out into the biting January air. The streets of Madrid were desolate, bathed in the sickly orange glow of sodium lamps that cast long, distorted shadows across the pavement. He drove toward Vicalvaro, the industrial district where the party had been held. The landscape there was different, harsher, filled with vacant lots and the skeletal remains of construction projects. He walked the path he thought she might have taken, his boots crunching on the frozen ground and the patches of thin ice that glazed the puddles. He called her name into the darkness, but his voice was swallowed by the wind. The area was a labyrinth of shadows and silence. He searched the periphery of the abandoned mansion where the teenagers had gathered, looking for any sign of a struggle, a dropped glove, or a footprint in the frost. There was nothing but the vast, empty expanse of the Spanish night, indifferent to a father's growing panic. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the horizon, Jesus made his way to the local police station. He hoped for a swift mobilization, for sirens and search parties to flood the streets. Instead, he was met with the cold, bureaucratic indifference of an early morning shift. The officers listened to his description of Susana, a teenager who loved rock music and dressed in black. They looked at the clock and then back at the distraught father. Their response was dismissive, almost routine. They suggested that at 16 years old, girls often have disagreements with their parents and decide to stay out a little longer. They hinted that perhaps she had simply run away with a boy or decided to extend the party at another location. They told him to wait, that she would likely walk through the front door by noon, sheepish and full of excuses. To them, she was just another rebellious youth. To Jesus, she was the center of his world, and he knew with a soul-deep certainty that Susanna would never have left them voluntarily. Returning home, the sight of the kitchen was the most painful of all. The morning sun hit the breakfast table, illuminating the place where Susanna should have been sitting. The empty chair stood as a silent, mocking testament to her absence. The milk remained in the carton, and the bread stayed on the counter, untouched. The house, which had always been filled with the energy of a teenager's life, felt like a museum of a person who had been erased in an instant. Josepha sat by the window, her eyes red from weeping, watching the street for a daughter who did not appear. Every car that passed, every distant shout from a neighbor, sent a jolt of hope through them, only for it to be crushed by the reality of the passing hours. The authorities' refusal to take the disappearance seriously added a layer of bitter frustration to their grief. They were alone in their search, left to navigate the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch on for nearly 50 days. In those first 12 hours, the foundation of their lives had crumbled. The police reports would later note the lack of immediate action, a delay that the family believed allowed the trail to go cold. But for now, there was only the cold kitchen, the silent telephone, and the haunting image of that empty chair. The neighborhood of San Blas began to wake up, the city of Madrid moving into its daily rhythm, unaware that a young life had slipped through the cracks of the night. Jesus looked out at the vocational school gates he guarded every day, realizing that while he could protect the building, he had been unable to protect his own child from the darkness that lay just beyond the reach of the streetlights. The wait had only just begun, a long and hollow vigil for a girl who had disappeared into the winter mist, leaving behind nothing but questions and a silence that grew louder with every passing second. The transition from hope to certainty is rarely a sudden leap. Instead, it is a slow, agonizing descent through the hours. By the third day, the feverish energy that had fueled the initial search for Susanna began to sour into a heavy, suffocating dread. In the neighborhood of Vicalvaro, the air seemed to thicken with every passing hour that she remained missing. The volunteers who had spent the first 48 hours calling her name until their voices broke now moved with a somber, rhythmic persistence. They were no longer looking for a girl who might be lost or hiding. They were looking for a shadow. The Madrid sun, usually so vibrant, felt pale and indifferent as it climbed over the industrial horizon, illuminating the dust and the gravel, but offering no warmth to the hearts of those waiting for news. Every telephone ring in the family home felt like a physical blow, and every silence that followed was a growing confirmation of the nightmare they were living through. The landscape of Vicalvaro at that time was a patchwork of growing urbanity and forgotten, desolate spaces. To the east, the rhythmic clatter of the train tracks provided a constant, industrial heartbeat to the search efforts. These tracks served as a boundary between the living world of the city and the wasteland of the industrial periphery. It was a place of rusted metal, discarded concrete, and the hardy, yellowed weeds of the Spanish plateau. As the search party moved closer to the tracks, the atmosphere shifted. The familiar sounds of cars and distant conversation were replaced by the lonely whistle of the wind whipping through empty warehouses and the occasional shriek of metal on metal from a passing locomotive. It was here, in this gray and beige world of neglect, that the searchers felt the strongest pull of unease. The ground was uneven, littered with the debris of a city in flux, and the vast, open sky offered no shelter from the mounting sense of tragedy. The specific lot where the search converged was an expanse of land that time seemed to have overlooked. It was a place where things were left to be forgotten, piles of old tires, shattered glass that glittered like diamonds in the dirt, and the skeletal remains of construction projects that had never reached completion. The earth here was packed hard, a pale, dusty crust that crunched beneath the heavy boots of the investigators. They walked in a line, eyes fixed on the ground, scanning the landscape for anything that did not belong. There is a specific kind of silence that descends upon a search party when they move into such a space. It is a silence born of respect, yes, but also of fear. They were searching for a girl of 16 years, a life that should have been full of music and laughter, yet they were looking for her in a graveyard of industrial waste. The contrast was a bitter pill to swallow for everyone involved in that long, final morning. It was just past noon when the shout went up. It wasn't a loud sound, but it carried across the vacant lot with a finality that stopped every heart in its tracks. A member of the search team had stopped near a slight depression in the earth, not far from where the tracks curved toward the horizon. For a long minute, there was only the sound of the wind. Then, the police moved in. The scene was as desolate as the imagination could fear. There, tucked away from the main path and partially obscured by the scrub and the shadows of a nearby concrete pillar, lay a figure. It was Susanna. She looked as though she had been cast aside by a world that didn't know how to value her. She was face down, her youthful frame appearing fragile and small against the harsh, unforgiving terrain. The vibrant colors of her clothing were now muted by the pale dust of the lot, and she was frozen in time, a tragic centerpiece in a landscape of ruins. As the forensics team arrived and the yellow tape began to flutter in the breeze, the reality of the discovery settled over the onlookers like a cold shroud. The site was meticulously documented. Investigators noted the way the body had been positioned, the lack of struggle in the immediate vicinity, and the chilling stillness of the scene. There was a sense that Susanna had been brought here, that this wasteland had been chosen for its isolation and its silence. The proximity to the train tracks added a layer of transient gloom. Hundreds of people had likely passed by in the days she had been missing, looking out of their carriage windows at the very spot where she lay, never knowing the horror that was hidden just beyond the glass. The industrial wasteland had kept its secret well, shielding the shadow in the lot from the eyes of the city, until the agonizing uncertainty could no longer be sustained. The discovery of Susanna's body changed everything. The search was over, but the mystery was only just beginning to take root. As the sun dipped lower, casting long, skeletal shadows across the vacant lot, the focus shifted from a rescue to a reckoning. The questions that had been whispered in the dark now demanded answers in the harsh light of day. Why here? Why Susanna? The industrial wasteland of Vicalvaro had yielded its victim, but it held on to its secrets with a stubborn, silent grip. The atmosphere was no longer one of frantic action, but of a deep, echoing sorrow that resonated through the streets of Madrid. A young life, once full of the bright promise of the future, had been extinguished in the most hollow of places. As the evening chill began to set in, the investigators worked through the twilight, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, searching for the invisible threads that might lead them from this desolate lot back to the person who had left her there. The transition from the open, biting wind of the wasteland in Vicalvaro to the heavy, sterile stillness of the morgue was a journey into a different kind of cold. In late February of 1993, the air in Madrid carried a dampness that seemed to settle in the joints, but inside the Institute of Forensic Medicine, the chill was clinical and unyielding. The silence here was not the absence of noise, but a thick, pressurized thing that sat upon the shoulders of everyone who entered. For the family of Susanna Ruiz, this was the place where the search ended and a new, more agonizing battle began. The medical examiners, draped in their pale green gowns, prepared to speak for a girl who could no longer speak for herself. Under the relentless hum of the overhead fluorescent lights, which flickered with a rhythmic, sickly yellow pulse, the first detailed examination of Susanna began. Every sound in that room was amplified. The sharp snap of latex gloves being pulled tight, the metallic chime of instruments meeting the tray, and the low, monotonous drone of a fan hidden somewhere in the ceiling. The initial report produced in 1993 was a document that would become the epicenter of a storm. As the examiners turned the pages of their findings, They focused on the physical state of the body, which had been exposed to the elements for 45 long days. They noted the dampness of the soil and the way the earth had pressed against her skin. But as they looked closer, they began to weave a narrative that felt increasingly detached from the violence of the scene where she was found. To the family, the evidence of a struggle was carved into her very bones. There was a severe blow to the head and a tooth that had been displaced, a jagged gap in a smile that used to light up the neighborhood of San Blas. Most chillingly, there was damage to the larynx, the delicate structure of the throat. To a layperson, these were the unmistakable marks of an assault, the physical footprints of a predator. Yet the medical examiners viewed these details through a different, more opaque lens, one that looked for explanations in the natural processes of the earth and the slow, quiet decay of time. Then came the conclusion that felt like a betrayal to those standing in the hallways. The official verdict was not homicide. Instead, the medical examiners pointed toward a cardiac event, a sudden stopping of the heart. They suggested that the combination of the biting winter cold, a possible pulmonary edema, and the potential ingestion of substances had caused her body to simply give up. They used the term natural causes to describe the end of a 16-year-old girl who had been found half buried in a field. The examiners claimed that the displaced tooth was not the result of a punch or a kick, but a consequence of the weight of her own body pressing against a piece of concrete for weeks. They argued the tooth had moved from the inside out during the natural process of putrefaction. It was a clinical explanation that seemed to sanitize the horror, turning a potential crime scene into a tragic, accidental intersection of biology and bad luck. The report was written in the dry, rhythmic language of science, but to the grieving relatives, it read like a dismissal. The tension between the official narrative and the family's reality began to vibrate with an almost electric intensity. Susanna's parents and friends remembered her as a girl of strength and vitality, not someone whose heart would simply fail in the middle of a walk home. They pointed to the state of her clothing, items that had been found inside out, a detail that screamed of a forced encounter. They couldn't reconcile the image of their daughter, full of rhythm and life, with the medical examiner's description of a fragile system collapsing under the cold. This was 1993, a time when the shadow of the Alcácer girls' murder still loomed large over the collective psyche of Spain. The public was on edge, and the idea that another young girl could be taken, only for the authorities to label it a natural occurrence, sparked a fire of distrust. The silence of the medical examiner, his refusal to deviate from his technical observations, felt like a wall being built around the truth. In the streets of San Blas, the frustration was palpable, a low roar of disbelief that grew louder with every passing day, that the case remained classified as a non-violent death. As the weeks stretched into months, the paper of the autopsy report began to yellow, but the questions only sharpened. The family's lawyer pushed for a second opinion, demanding that the broken larynx be re-examined as evidence of manual strangulation. They spoke of the bruises that the examiners had dismissed as post-mortem changes. Every detail became a battlefield. The scent of ink and the rustle of legal papers filled the small rooms where the family met to discuss their next steps. They felt as though they were fighting two ghosts, the person who had taken Susanna and the system that refused to admit she had been taken at all. The medical examiner's office remained a fortress of professional detachment, insisting that the data did not support a finding of homicide. This silence, this clinical refusal to see the violence that seemed so obvious to the naked eye, created a vacuum of justice. It was a silence that echoed in the empty bedroom of the Ruiz home, a silence that demanded an answer the 1993 reports were simply unwilling to give. The case was drifting into a realm of ambiguity, where the truth was buried not just in the earth of Vicalvaro, but under layers of technical jargon and official resistance. As the winter of 1993 tightened its grip on the streets of Madrid. The formal papers of the autopsy sat in their folders, their conclusions feeling increasingly hollow to those who knew Susana. Outside the sterile walls of the morgue and the hushed offices of lawyers, a different kind of investigation was beginning to pulse through the city. To understand what happened to a 16-year-old girl on a freezing January night, the authorities had to step away from the clinical and into the visceral. They had to descend into the damp, shadowed corners of Vicalvaro and San Blas, where the youth of the era carved out their own world far from the watchful eyes of their parents. The investigation was no longer just about cells and toxicology. It was about the heavy rhythm of the streets, the smell of cheap tobacco, and the defiant leather jackets of a generation searching for identity in a changing Spain. Madrid in the early 90s was a mosaic of clashing subcultures. While the mainstream was dancing to the electronic beats of the bacalao scene, a darker, more rebellious aesthetic thrived in the outskirts. Susana moved within a circle of friends who identified with the alternative, the punk, and the heavy metal movements. These were teenagers who wore their hair in defiant peaks, their clothes adorned with safety pins and patches of bands that screamed against the status quo. To the detectives, this world was a labyrinth of unwritten rules and deep-seated distrust of authority. When the police began to frequent the small, smoke-filled bars where Susana and her friends gathered, they were met with a wall of silence that felt as cold as the pavement outside. The air in these venues was thick with the scent of damp wool and stale beer, and every question asked by a man in a suit seemed to hang suspended, unanswered, amidst the low hum of a jukebox. The focus of the inquiry narrowed onto the night of January 9th. Detectives began the painstaking process of interviewing Susana's inner circle, trying to recreate a timeline that seemed to blur with every retelling. They sat in small, cramped interrogation rooms where the only sound was the scratching of a pen on a yellow legal pad. The friends described a birthday celebration, a gathering of souls who felt like outcasts. They spoke of a squatted mansion, a space reclaimed by the youth for concerts and parties, where the music drowned out the whispers of the world. As the detectives listened, they tried to visualize the movement of the crowd, how a group of 30 or 40 teenagers shifted through the darkness of Vicalvaro, their laughter echoing off the stone walls of the nearby cemetery. But the stories were like silk, slipping through the fingers of the law. One friend remembered her laughing near the entrance. Another recalled her walking toward the shadows, alone but confident. As the interviews stretched into the late hours, a darker thread began to weave its way through the narrative. In the early 90s, the streets were not just home to punks and dreamers. They were also a battleground for more extremist elements. Whispers began to circulate about the presence of neo-Nazi groups, specifically a radical collective known as Bases Autonomas. The detectives heard fragments of conversations, mentions of heavy boots on the gravel, of silhouettes that didn't belong to the punk scene, lurking near the periphery of the party. There was a palpable fear in the eyes of the young witnesses when these names were mentioned. It was a fear that transcended the typical teenage rebellion. This was the fear of a predator. The police had to discern if these were merely urban legends born of a polarized city, or if Susana had inadvertently crossed paths with a darkness that her friends were too terrified to name. Reconstructing the final hours of that January night became an exercise in atmospheric archaeology. The investigators walked the path from the concert hall toward the open fields of Vicalvaro, trying to feel the transition from the crowded warmth of the party to the desolate, biting wind of the wasteland. They noted the distance to the cemetery, the way the streetlights flickered and failed at the edge of the residential blocks. Every friend they interviewed added a tiny, sensory detail. The way the light caught the silver of Susana's jewelry, the specific song that was playing when she was last seen, the coldness of the soda cans they held in their hands. Yet, for all these details, the core of the night remained a void. The social circle, usually so tight-knit, seemed to have fractured in the darkness. They were a group of teenagers who lived for the moment, and that night, the moment had swallowed one of their own without a sound. The pressure on the social circle grew as the weeks passed. The police were convinced that someone within the group knew more than they were admitting. They began to lean on the regulars of the San Blas scene, searching for the crack in the armor. They heard rumors of children of important people who were allegedly present that night, individuals whose names carried weight and whose involvement might explain the strange hesitancy of certain witnesses. The air in the neighborhood grew heavy with suspicion. Friends who had once shared everything now looked at each other with narrowed eyes, wondering who had seen what, and who was being paid or threatened to stay silent. The investigators spent hours in their cars, watching the squares where the youth gathered, hoping to catch a whispered confession or a nervous glance that would finally bridge the gap between the party and the tragedy. By the end of this phase of the investigation, the map of Susanna's world was laid out on the precinct walls, pinned with photos of leather-clad teenagers and hand-drawn diagrams of squatted buildings. It was a world of rebellion, of music, and of a fierce, protective loyalty. But it was also a world that was being haunted by a ghost. The whispers among the youth of Madrid suggested that the truth was hidden somewhere between the loud chords of a punk anthem and the silent, frost-covered ground of the Vicalvaro cemetery. The detectives knew they were close to the heart of the matter, yet the closer they got, the more the social circle seemed to pull inward, protecting a secret that was far too heavy for any 16-year-old to carry alone. The investigation was hovering on the edge of a revelation, caught in the tension between those who wanted to remember and those who were desperate to forget. The map of Vicalvaro was a spiderweb of ink and string, but the most haunting marks were the ones left by the shadows. In the deep winter of 1993, the air in Madrid was sharp, cutting through wool and skin alike. The vacant lot where the search centered was a desolate stretch of earth, a wound in the urban landscape where the city's progress had simply stopped. It was here, amidst the rusted skeletons of abandoned machinery and the whispering tall grass, that the story of the stranger began to take shape. Investigators shifted focus to a presence that was far more menacing. It was a lead that came from the periphery, from those who lived on the edges of the lot, watching the world through half-drawn blinds. One witness, a woman whose name was shielded by the decades, spoke of a vehicle. It was dark, perhaps a deep navy or a bruised charcoal gray, idling at the edge of the dirt path. In the stillness of the night, the sound of an engine is never just a sound. It is a pulse. She described the way the headlights were extinguished, leaving only the amber glow of the dashboard and the occasional flare of a lighter. The car sat there for hours, a metallic predator waiting in the tall weeds. The smell of exhaust hung heavy in the damp air, mixing with the scent of frozen mud. This wasn't a car belonging to the neighborhood. In a place where everyone recognized the rattle of their neighbor's muffler, this silence was an intrusion. Then there was the man. He did not stay inside the safety of the steel frame. He stepped out into the biting January wind. The witness remembered the sound most of all, the crunch of heavy boots on the frost-covered gravel. It was a slow, deliberate cadence. He wore a leather jacket, the kind that was heavy and stiff, catching what little light spilled from the distant street lamps. The leather creaked as he moved, a sound like old saddles or shifting timber. To the observer, he seemed untroubled by the cold. He stood at the very edge of the lot, looking inward toward the darkness where the shadows were deepest. He was a silhouette of sharp angles, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched against a chill he didn't seem to feel. The texture of that jacket became a focal point for the investigation. It wasn't the worn, soft leather of a well-loved garment, but something that looked thick, perhaps new, or perhaps simply well-maintained. It gave him an air of belonging to a different world, one of late-night bars and rain-slicked highways, far removed from the domestic quiet of Vicalvaro. The witness noted that he didn't look like the other teenagers who frequented the area. He was older, his movements more grounded, more certain. He paced a small perimeter, 5 steps forward, 5 steps back, his eyes never leaving the center of the wasteland. There was a patience in his stance that felt predatory, a stillness that suggested he was exactly where he intended to be at that precise hour. When the police eventually followed this thread, they found themselves chasing a phantom. The description was both vivid and frustratingly generic. A dark car, a man in a leather jacket, in the early 90s, this was a uniform for a certain subset of Madrid's youth. Yet, the witness insisted there was something specific about him, a sense of otherness that the sketches couldn't quite capture. The detectives combed through the registration records for every dark Renault and seat in the district, but the stranger had left no paper trail. He had arrived in the dark, occupied the space with his heavy presence. And then, as the first gray light of morning touched the horizon, he had simply vanished from the site, leaving the lot as empty as before. The missed opportunity weighed heavily on the precinct. The statement had been taken days after the initial disappearance, a delay that allowed the physical evidence of his presence to degrade. By the time the dogs were brought to the lot, the scent of the stranger had been replaced by the smell of damp earth and city soot. The witness's memory, once sharp, began to blur under the pressure of repeated questioning. Was the jacket black or brown? Was the car a 4-door or a 2-door? The more they pushed, the more the stranger receded into the fog of uncertainty. He became a ghost in the machine of the investigation, a figure that everyone believed held the key, yet no one could truly grasp or identify. As the months passed, the image of the man in the leather jacket haunted Susanna's family. He was the personification of the silence that swallowed their daughter. They imagined him in that lot, knowing secrets the world was desperate to uncover. But the stranger never returned. He remained a fragment, a dark shape slipping through the fingers of justice like smoke through a screen door. The investigation moved on to other names and other faces, but the echo of those heavy boots on the gravel never truly faded from the collective memory of the neighborhood, leaving the cold wind to whistle through the vacant lot where the truth lay hidden in the deep shadows of the past. As the winter of 1993 deepened over Madrid, the air in the neighborhood of San Blas grew thick with a different kind of cold. It was not just the biting frost that settled on the brickwork of the apartment blocks, but a chilling uncertainty that seemed to seep through the floorboards of every home. The disappearance of young Susanna had already left a hollow ache in the community. But as weeks turned into a month, the silence was replaced by a cacophony of whispers. These were the shadows of theories, born in the dim light of local bars and the flickering glow of evening news broadcasts. People began to look at the vacant lots and the industrial fringes of the city not just as empty spaces, but as containers for dark, hidden secrets. The mystery was no longer a private tragedy. It was becoming a public obsession, fed by a hunger for answers that the official investigation could not yet provide. When the discovery was finally made in the desolate fields of Vicalvaro, the reality was grim, but the narrative that followed was stranger still. The landscape there was unforgiving, a stretch of parched earth and scrubland where the wind whistled through rusted fences. It was a place of transit, forgotten by the bustling center of Madrid. Finding her there, half-shrouded by the winter dust, should have brought a somber clarity to the case. Instead, it ignited a firestorm of sensationalism. The Spanish media, caught in a period of transition and a growing appetite for the macabre, began to weave a tapestry of ritualistic dread. They spoke of the position of the body and the state of the surrounding ground as if they were reading omens in the dirt. There was a desperate, almost feverish attempt to find a grand, occult meaning behind a senseless loss of life. The headlines began to scream of dark cults and secret societies operating in the shadows of the capital. Journalists and armchair detectives pointed to the supposed symbolism of the date, and the proximity to certain landmarks. They whispered about the autonomous bases, a radical group whose name alone carried a weight of political and social menace. The theory was seductive in its complexity. It suggested that Susanna had not simply crossed paths with a predator, but had been chosen as a symbolic victim for a ritual of initiation. This idea of a calculated, organized evil was, in a strange way, more palatable to the public than the thought of a random act of violence. It gave the tragedy a structure, a villainous architecture that people could visualize. But as these ritualistic red herrings gathered momentum, they began to drift further and further away from the quiet, cold facts of the earth. In the newsrooms, the ink was barely dry on stories of black magic before new rumors emerged about the children of the powerful. This was another layer of the red herring, the notion that Susanna's death was being covered up by high-ranking figures to protect their own. The air was thick with talk of important people and clandestine parties that ended in blood. While these stories sold papers and kept the city in a state of high-alert anxiety, they acted like a thick fog over the actual crime scene. Forensic reality is often much quieter and less cinematic than the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the dark. While the public searched for signs of the devil or the corrupt elite, the subtle evidence in the dirt, the fibers, the faint imprints of shoes, the physical trauma recorded by the coroner, was being drowned out by the noise of 1,000 urban myths. The first autopsy only added to the confusion, acting as its own kind of forensic red herring. It suggested a cause of death that felt jarringly at odds with the physical state in which she was found. The report spoke of substance ingestion, implying a tragic, accidental end in the cold night. But the family, and eventually a segment of the public, could not reconcile this with the broken tooth and the injuries to her throat. This discrepancy became the fertile soil where the ritual theories grew even taller. If the official word didn't match the visible wounds, then surely, people reasoned, there must be a grander conspiracy at play. The focus shifted from what happened to who is lying. And in that shift, the search for the man in the leather jacket or any tangible suspect began to lose its sharp edge, blunted by the weight of 100 sensationalist what-ifs. Imagine the parents sitting in their living room, the television casting a blue, flickering light over the photographs of their daughter. They had to endure not only the absence of her voice, but the presence of 1,000 false ones. Every night, a new theory, a new ritual, a new red herring was offered up like a cruel gift. The media's obsession with the autonomous bases and the ritualistic disfigurement turned their daughter into a character in a horror story rather than a 16-year-old girl who just wanted to go home after a concert. The forensic reality, the broken larynx, the specific trauma was being used as a prop for ghost stories rather than a lead for justice. This was the tragedy within the tragedy. The truth was being buried under the very efforts meant to uncover it, leaving the family to wander through a labyrinth of shadows where every exit was a dead end of someone else's imagination. As the months stretched into years, the ritual theories eventually began to fade, leaving behind a residue of distrust and unsolved questions. The satanic panic style of reporting that had gripped Madrid eventually cooled, but the damage was done. The investigation had been pulled in so many directions by these red herrings that the original trail had gone cold, frozen over like the fields of Vicalvaro. We are left to wonder how much closer we might have been to the truth if the focus had remained on the quiet details instead of the loud, terrifying myths. The rituals were a fiction, but the pain was, and remains, entirely real. Tonight, we remember that beneath the sensational headlines, there was a life that deserved more than a ghost story. Breathe in the cool, still air of the present, and let the noise of those old theories drift away into the dark. You are safe now, and the truth, however hidden, no longer needs to shout. Time has a peculiar way of settling over a mystery, much like the fine, amber dust that blankets the streets of Madrid during the height of a dry summer. As the final years of the 1990s dissolved into the turn of the new millennium, the urgency that once gripped the district of San Blas began to shift. It did not disappear, but rather, it transformed. The frantic energy of the initial search and the sharp, jagged edges of the early theories started to wear down, smoothed over by the relentless passage of days, months, and eventually, years. By the time the world celebrated the arrival of the year 2000, the case of the girl found in the wasteland had entered a new phase of its existence. It was no longer a breaking news story or a fresh wound. It had become a quiet, permanent ache in the heart of the community, a story that felt as old as the sun-scorched earth itself. Inside the police archives, the physical evidence of the crime began its long sleep. The folders, once crisp and frequently handled, grew heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. You can almost imagine the silence of those rooms, where the air is still and smells faintly of old paper and ink. The file for the San Blas case lay among thousands of others, its edges curling slightly, its contents becoming a static record of a moment frozen in 1993. Every few years, a new detective might pull it from the shelf, their fingers tracing the names of witnesses who had since moved away or memories that had grown hazy. They would look at the grainy photographs of the wasteland, seeing the pale light and the shadows of the excavation, and they would feel the immense pressure of the silence that followed. The decade of dust had begun, a period where the trail grew not just cold, but nearly invisible under the layers of time. In the streets of San Blas, the neighborhood was physically changing. The early 2000s brought a wave of modern development to Madrid. New apartment blocks with bright, terracotta facades began to rise where once there were only jagged fields of weeds and discarded stone. Cranes haunted the skyline like skeletal birds, and the sound of jackhammers replaced the quiet whispers of the past. But even as the concrete poured and the wasteland was slowly paved over, the memory of what had happened there refused to be buried. For the people who had lived through the winter of 1993, the new parks and paved roads were merely a thin veil. They knew that beneath the fresh asphalt lay the ground that had held a secret for 10 years. The emotional toll on the residents was subtle but profound. It manifested as a lingering protective instinct, a collective shadow that fell over the plazas whenever the sun began to set. By the year 2003, a full decade had passed since the discovery. In this time, the victim had transitioned from a person into a symbol. She was now the girl of the wasteland, a figure of urban folklore that mothers used to warn their children about the dangers of the dark. The story was told in hushed tones behind the counters of small bakeries and on the benches where the elderly gathered to watch the world go by. It became a ghost story, stripped of its forensic details and replaced with a haunting, generalized dread. People would point toward the areas where the old mines used to be, telling stories of a pale figure seen wandering the fringes of the new developments. This was the folklore of the unsolved, a way for a community to process a trauma that the justice system had failed to resolve. The mystery had become part of the local identity, a dark thread woven into the fabric of San Blas. The early 2000s were also a time of technological transition. DNA profiling and digital databases were beginning to revolutionize criminal investigations across Europe, but for the case in Madrid, these advancements seemed like distant promises. The evidence gathered in the early 90s had been stored in a different era, and the transition to the digital age was slow and fraught with difficulty. There was a sense of frustration among the veterans of the force, a feeling that the keys to the mystery were right there, hidden in the dust, if only they had the right tools to find them. But for now, the tools remained out of reach, and the case remained a cold file. The detectives who had first stood in the mud of the wasteland were retiring, passing the burden of the girl's memory to a younger generation who only knew her through the yellowing pages of the archive. As the sun set over Madrid in those middle years of the decade, the golden light would catch the windows of the new buildings in San Blas, casting long, dramatic shadows across the pavement. In those moments, when the city felt both ancient and brand new, the weight of the decade of dust was most palpable. 10 years of silence. 10 years of parents looking at their daughters with a little more fear than they once did. The girl of the wasteland was still there, waiting in the periphery of the city's consciousness. The investigation was not dead, but it was dreaming, held in a state of suspended animation while the world moved on around it. The dust continued to settle, layer by layer, until the events of 1993 felt like a dream shared by an entire city, a dream from which they could not quite wake up. The hallway of the Las Muses Institute in San Blas was often filled with the echoing footsteps of students, but in the quiet hours of the evening, when the last bell had long since faded, a different kind of sound took over. It was the sound of a father, Jose Maria Ruiz, moving through the shadows of the building where he worked and lived as a caretaker. For years, the walls of that school had absorbed the weight of a vow that grew heavier with every passing season. In the middle years of the decade, as the neighborhood around him transformed and the new buildings reached toward the sky, Jose Maria remained anchored to a singular, painful purpose. He did not see the golden light on the glass or the modernizing streets of Madrid. He saw only the face of his daughter, Susana, and the cold, clinical words of the official reports that claimed her death was a mere accident of the heart. To the authorities, she was a closed file, a tragic consequence of a cold night in 1993. To him, she was a question that had been answered with a lie, and he refused to let that lie become her legacy. The legal battle that followed was not fought with grand speeches in sunlit courtrooms, but in the cramped offices of lawyers and the dusty archives of the judiciary. Jose Maria and Susana's family found themselves navigating an institutional inertia that felt like a wall of thick, unyielding glass. They submitted petition after petition, their hands clutching folders filled with independent observations that contradicted the state's narrative. Every time a judge dismissed their concerns, every time a prosecutor pointed to the original autopsy as the final word, the family felt the sting of a second loss. They were told that the teenage girl, only 16 when she vanished, had simply suffered a cardiac arrest. They were told there was no violence, no struggle. But the family looked at the photographs of the wasteland in Vicalvaro where she was found, and they saw things the experts seemed to ignore. They saw the way her clothes had been displaced, the marks that whispered of a struggle, and the sheer impossibility of the timeline the police had constructed. It was this refusal to accept the easy answer that drove them to demand the unthinkable, the exhumation of her body. The morning of the exhumation in June of 1995 was draped in a heavy, humid silence. The air in the cemetery was thick with the scent of damp earth and the sharp, metallic tang of the tools used by the workers. For a father, this was the ultimate sacrifice of peace, to disturb his daughter's rest in the hope of finding the truth hidden in her bones. Jose Maria stood at the edge of the site, his silhouette etched against the gray sky of Madrid, a man who had aged decades in just a few short years. He watched as the heavy stone was lifted, the scraping sound of masonry on masonry echoing through the quiet rows of graves. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, where the private grief of a family was laid bare before the cold eyes of science and the law. They were searching for what the first investigators had missed, looking for the physical evidence of the violence they knew in their hearts had taken place. They were looking for the truth that the earth had been keeping secret for more than 2 years. As the independent forensic experts began their work, a new narrative started to emerge from the silence of the examination room. They looked closely at the structures that the initial autopsy had skimmed over. They found a broken tooth, a detail that had been dismissed as a post-mortem accident, but which now seemed to point to a forceful blow to the face. Even more chilling was the discovery regarding her larynx. The experts noted signs of trauma that suggested pressure had been applied to her neck, the unmistakable signature of strangulation. These were not the markers of a heart that had simply stopped beating due to the cold or the elements. These were the marks of a life taken by force. The family felt a grim sort of validation, a cold comfort in knowing they had been right all along. Yet, even as the scientific evidence mounted, the institutional resistance did not crumble. The courts looked at the new findings and still hesitated, clinging to the original theories as if letting go would admit a systemic failure they were not prepared to face. The quest for justice became a marathon of endurance. José María would spend his days at the Institute and his nights poring over legal documents, his eyes growing weary under the dim light of his desk lamp. He became a familiar figure in the halls of justice, a man who refused to be discouraged by the polite dismissals of officials. The family's persistence was a quiet storm, a steady pressure that refused to dissipate. They reached out to anyone who would listen, from journalists to independent investigators, weaving a network of support that bridged the gap between the abandoned wasteland of Vicalvaro and the high chambers of the Madrid courts. They were fighting against the passage of time itself, knowing that every year that drifted by made the trail colder and the memories of witnesses more fragile. The statute of limitations loomed in the distance like a darkening horizon, a 20-year deadline that threatened to bury the truth forever under the weight of legal finality. Through the late 90s and into the early years of the new millennium, the family's vow remained unbroken. They had seen the case reopened and closed 4 separate times, a cycle of hope and heartbreak that would have shattered a lesser resolve. Every time a new witness emerged, or a new lead was whispered in the shadows of San Blas, they were there to push the door open once again. They spoke of the group of young men seen near the party that night, the rumors of influential figures who might have been shielded, and the strange inconsistencies in the police logs. The father's quest was no longer just about his own daughter. It had become a symbol of the struggle for accountability in a system that often preferred the convenience of silence over the difficulty of the truth. Even as his hair turned silver and his steps slowed, José María's voice never lost its clarity when he spoke her name. He was the keeper of her memory, the sentinel who stood between his daughter and the world's desire to forget what had happened in the darkness of that January night. In the heart of Madrid, within the sterile white walls of the Civil Guard's biology laboratory, a quiet revolution was taking place. The air here is always cool, filtered to remove any trace of modern contamination, creating a sanctuary where time is measured not by hours, but by the slow extraction of genetic sequences. For decades, the case file had sat on a shelf, a heavy reminder of a life stolen in 1993. Now, the investigators were returning to the physical remains of that night with a sense of cautious optimism. The room hums with the steady drone of cooling fans and the rhythmic clicking of automated pipettes, sounds that underscore the meticulous nature of the work. Every motion made by the scientists is deliberate, an attempt to coax a secret from a past that has remained silent for a generation. The evidence itself is a window into a different era. Inside a cardboard box, preserved with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, lie the garments collected at the scene. In the early 1990s, the preservation of biological material was a fledgling science, often hampered by a lack of climate control or the use of plastic bags that trapped moisture. To the modern eye, these pieces of fabric appear fragile, their fibers stiffened by time and the natural chemical processes of aging. Yet, they remain the most vital connection to the events of that night. The technicians use specialized lighting to scan every single centimeter of the cloth, looking for the invisible, a single skin cell, a microscopic fragment of hair, or the faint, translucent stain of touch DNA that might have been left behind during a violent struggle. Forensic technology has evolved at a breathtaking pace since the original investigation. Back then, scientists required a substantial amount of biological material, a visible pool of blood, to create a DNA profile. Today, the field of genetics has moved into the realm of the infinitesimal. They utilize a process called polymerase chain reaction to amplify tiny, damaged strands of DNA, copying them millions of times until a coherent picture begins to emerge. In this Madrid laboratory, the search was no longer just for a direct match in a database, but for the deeper markers of identity. They looked for lineages that could trace a paternal line back through centuries, or mitochondrial DNA that whispered of a mother's ancestry. This new science was a bridge, extending a hand back through 25 years of darkness to pull the truth into the light. However, the reality of evidence degradation is a constant, heartbreaking shadow in the lab. DNA is a complex molecule, a beautiful but fragile ladder of information that can be broken by simple environmental factors. Moisture, bacteria, and even the natural acidity of the fabric can cause the genetic chains to snap, leaving behind only fragments of a story. In many cold cases, the transition to the 2010s revealed a devastating truth. Some samples had simply dissolved into nothingness. The scientists in Madrid faced this hurdle with a grim determination, often finding that a sample once considered promising had become a jumble of unreadable letters. It is a race against entropy, a struggle to capture the last remaining whispers of a killer before they are erased forever by the slow, grinding mill of the passing decades. Despite the deterioration, the team turned to the frontier of phenotyping, a technology that allows them to predict physical traits from genetic data. They weren't just looking for a name anymore, they were looking for a face. By analyzing specific markers, they could determine the likely color of the suspect's eyes, the shade of his skin, and even the geographical region where his ancestors had walked. This was new science in its most visceral form, turning a cold sequence of alleles into a portrait of a living person. They discovered markers that suggested a lineage from North Africa, a clue that narrowed the search from millions of possibilities to a specific, manageable group. Every new result, no matter how small, was a victory over the silence of the grave. They looked at the evidence with eyes that saw the invisible. This scientific endeavor was never solely about the machines or the chemical reagents. It was fueled by the weight of a family's enduring hope. Every time a new extraction was attempted, the same prayer was whispered in the shadows of the laboratory. They knew that somewhere, perhaps in a microscopic cluster of cells no wider than a needle's point, the truth was waiting to be read. As the sun set over the Spanish capital, casting long, amber shadows across the floor, the machines continued their work, whirring softly in the dark. The investigation remained a bridge, built of steel and resolve, stretching across the years toward a resolution that felt closer with every passing day. The past was no longer out of reach. It was simply waiting for the right light to be shone upon it, revealing the secrets of the night. As the final notes of this story begin to soften, we find ourselves standing in the long, cooling shadows of the Vicalvaro district. The year 1993 feels distant, yet the air in these Madrid streets still seems to hold the echo of a bass line from a concert that never truly ended. For decades, the case of Susana Ruiz has been called an unfinished symphony, a composition of questions, whispers, and grief that lacks its final, resolving chord. We look back now at the girl who was only 16, a teenager with a love for heavy rock and a shy smile, whose disappearance on that cold January night transformed the legal landscape of an entire nation. The investigation, once a frantic storm of activity, has settled into the quiet stillness of archived paper and dust. The courtrooms have grown silent, and the gavel has fallen for the last time on a case relegated to the heavy drawer of absolute impunity. To understand the weight of this silence, We must look at the legacy left in the wake of the tragedy. Before Susana vanished, the protocols for missing persons in Spain were often governed by a cruel and invisible clock. Families were frequently told to wait 24, 48, or even 72 hours before a formal search could begin, under the assumption that a teenager might simply be rebelling or staying out late. But Susana's father knew within hours that the silence from his daughter was not a choice. Her case became the catalyst for change, a painful lesson that forced the hand of Spanish law. Today, the immediate response protocols for missing minors stand as a shield for others, ensuring that no more hours are lost to bureaucratic waiting while a child is in danger. This is her quiet victory, a law written in the ink of a family's persistence, ensuring that when a child goes missing, the sirens wail immediately. The details of that final search remain etched in the memory of the city. For nearly 50 days, the community walked the scrubland, their boots crunching on frozen earth and discarded glass. It was on the 25th of February that the earth finally gave up its secret in a field near the M40 highway. The discovery brought no peace, only a deepening of the mystery. We remember the conflicting reports that followed, the official narrative of a tragic accident versus the family's conviction of a violent end. There were whispers of dark figures in the night, of radical groups and witnesses who vanished or met their own violent fates. These threads of the story were woven into a complex tapestry of fear and suspicion that the justice system ultimately could not untangle. The case was opened and closed 4 separate times, each time leaving the heart of the matter untouched and the guilty, if they exist, walking free in the amber glow of the Madrid sunset. Even now, if you were to visit the place where Susana was found, you might feel the profound stillness of an unresolved history. The urban landscape has shifted, the concrete has crept further into the fields, and the sounds of the city have grown louder. Yet the memory of a young girl in a leather jacket remains. Her story serves as a reminder of the fragility of truth and the enduring power of a parent's love. Her father, who searched the wasteland with his dogs day after day, never stopped asking the questions that the authorities chose to stop answering. He became a symbol of a different kind of justice, not the kind found in a verdict, but the kind found in the refusal to forget. The symphony is unfinished because the truth remains hidden, but the music of her life still vibrates through every change in the law that protects the vulnerable today. We let the facts drift away now, like autumn leaves caught in a gentle breeze over the Manzanares River. The contradictions of the autopsies, the names of the suspects, and the dates written in ink all begin to blur. What remains is a sense of profound respect for a life that, though short, changed the path of a country. The mystery of Susana Ruiz is now a part of the city's bones, a secret kept by the dark soil and the night sky. We do not need to carry the weight of the unsolved tonight. We can acknowledge the shadows and then turn toward the light. The work of the investigators is done. The protests have ended. The candles have burned down to their wicks, leaving only a faint scent of wax in the cool evening air. You have walked through the labyrinth of this case, and now you have reached the exit. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.